Hello YouTube, my name is Paul Kroon and I'm a Power Platform Specialist at Macau in the Netherlands. And in this video we're gonna look at a example for a solution I made for a customer, which basically um, you will encounter sometimes in your life. That you have to get information from an external system to your SharePoint list and then drill it into your Power Apps to use it to check some things or uh, basically check if something is not having stocks or is already processed or whatever you need to do. In my case, every night this file is extracted from an Oracle system and there are about 5 flows running for different lists. And the problem is here, and let's go to the screen, is uh, that basically we have 5 flows running and you see the flow is running a long time. Why is that? Because the first approach, the approach of the customer, was to say, okay, we do this every night. Then at the right, we get all the items from our SharePoint list. We loop through those, delete the items. The other branch is to get information from our endpoints. In my case, Oracle, but in this case, I use an HTTP request for simulation purposes. And then after both branches are finished, then loop through these records we get from our HTTP request and then create items again. But you see, based on the timeout, this can fail. So we, of course, can fix this to set the timeout higher, but still sometimes this will fail when we look at functionality. And also this means that when we have 4 lists or 5 lists or 6 lists, we have to create all those lists to store our data. So here, for example, I have the photo from the JSON placeholder fake API, which I use. I'm going to use this API to show you another way to do these kind of things. And then I put this data in my list. And then we run into another problem when we want to use this in Power Apps, that we have that limitation of 500 to maximum 2000 records we can pull in to Power Apps, so we have to have a live connection always. So I was thinking about this and I think, okay, let's make a way to do this better and easier and make this faster also, knowing that this is basically a set of data which is of course updated every day, but for the day itself static. It doesn't gonna change during the day. It doesn't has to be updated. It doesn't have to interact with my data and have like a webhook putting it back all the time. No, we just have to have this information on the day we're working with this to see the stock on that specific moment. So what I did is another approach. So first I created the list, external data. Of course I have the title, and this title I will use to filter on. So for every call I do to my data source, I basically create one item here with a different name. So I'm going to create albums, I'm going to create users, I'm going to create photos, and just one item for each of those calls. Then I store a date, which is basically an ISO formatted date with 2020, 12 for December, and 08 for the day. I'm gonna store that here so I can filter on that things. And I have a multi line field, so a comment field, where I can store my data. And I'm gonna store this data in not a list like, but I'm gonna use another format for this, which I can basically unpack again in SharePoint, and you will see that in a moment. Then we have an is inactive field, and why not is active? Because is active is then 0, and then inactive would be 0, or 0 instead of 1. And then when we put an index on this SharePoint list, then the ones will be the zeros will be on top. So when we go to our list settings, and I will show you, Here we have that number field for the date int. We have the inactive is also a number because Power Apps can't work very well with the boolean, so I choose a number. But the most important is this index columns part. You see the date in I indexed, so this makes it possible when I store one file every day that in December 2001 I can see the stock information or other information from January 2001 by picking a date and then get this data and put it into a collection of any kind, and you see the in is inactive. So when we have 10,000 or 20,000 records, the zero is going to be on top, and that are only that 4 or 5 records we get from our calls in Flow. Now we're going to build this together, and from start to finish, first in Flow and then in Power Apps, and then you will see how this works. So what I first did is make a flow. I have recurrence every night at 3 p.m. this works, and I have a variable or a compose with a UTC now function, and in there you can have single quotes and just a string how you want to show this date. So if we save this and we would perform a test, you will see that the date of today is the date we have and we can use when we pay something in the date int field. So now what we're gonna do, we're gonna do different calls. So first we want to add a scope, and we rename this scope because this is gonna be the users. Let's start with that. Then we want to have a branch, and again we want to have a scope. This is gonna be the albums, and we have another branch, again a scope, and here we're gonna store all the reference to our photos. And of course we ain't gonna do this all, but we're gonna do probably the users, maybe the albums, but surely the users. So now, as I said, we're gonna use the JSON placeholder, and here we can have some users into here. So we go there and then we see our JSON formatted string, and we can pick this URL, go to our flow, and just say we need an HTTP request. And of course this can also be an Oracle database or a SAP database or whatever kind of database which returns an object or a list of objects which you want to use. Now, here we want to have a get, and we're gonna parse in this URL. And of course we could also separate this by getting the URL, put it on top as a variable, and then concatenate. But we ain't gonna do that now. So we don't need authentication on this one. And let's first say, okay, we want to have compose, and just put our body we return from this API into a compose. And let's then save and test this flow. So runs quite fast, so we get information back and we have our data. Now what we want to do is to select only the properties we want from our data. And then you see we run in a problem because we don't have the schema in here. So we can select our mapping here. So we can select the values and we can put in a key. So let's delete this for now and just say add a parse JSON. And this will basically get our response body and puts it into a schema. Now we can do like 2 curly brackets to have an empty schema, and then run this and get the schema from our process. We can also, of course, go to the endpoint and get our information there. And I think this would be the schema, the same as we have before. So let's see if this is the case. So now we have a schema when we use select and we connect it to the parse JSON. And when it's right, we have a ID. We have a name. Let's say we like to have their email also. So now we have 3 properties outside of our response we like to use to have a new schema with only those properties applied. What we gonna use then is, and this is because we can't parse JSON formatted string to a collection in Power Apps yet. We can do it, have a table and then parse it to JSON formatted text, but we can't do it the other way around yet. That's why I'm gonna have another approach. I'm gonna create a CSV table, and this selection output will create it in a CSV table, and that I want to store in our SharePoint site. Let's take SharePoint, create an item. Gonna create an item, or learn Power Apps, external data. Or title should be not a variable because our title is gonna be users. The date int is coming from the data int we created and at the top, and our data is gonna be our CSV file. And you see the is inactive is 0. And this is gonna create a record for today. Then tomorrow we're gonna have another record. And what we want to do is everything created today we want to set to inactive. So we also only have one file, always return to Power Apps if we start our application, but that's the file of today. So here we're gonna get items, and why do we do get items? Because we don't know the ID of the item which is active. So inactive should be 0 and put it on the top, because then it's gonna first look at is inactive, and that's our basically just a few files later on. And then for the title we want to do the same as the title when we create a user. So now we get a list, probably of 1, because we're gonna do this all day, but to be sure we don't do a top count. So even if we have multiple records, this will keep working, just to be sure. And what we're gonna do, we're gonna update our item on our list, of course. And we're gonna grab the ID of the get item, and then we will automatically get a loop, because this is a list. And whether it's a list of 1 or more, it's still want to loop through those lists. Now, the title is mandatory. I don't know why, because we're gonna update and the title should be already in this file, but okay, this is the item, and from our apply to each item we can just grab the title and paste the same title as we had before. And the only thing we're gonna do is set the is inactive to 1. So now what we have is we have a request, we parse this to JSON, we get only the properties we want, we create a CSV file, we look for items we already created and set them to not active, and then create another item. So let's save this. And run this flow. And you will see this flow run for 45 minutes and bounced, and this flow after 2 seconds is already done. And if we go to our SharePoint list, you see we have a users item on this date with a CSV data, and this is active. So let's change this value or this date to yesterday. So let's say it's 3 o'clock in the night, and this flow is run again in the next day. Let's run the flow. Done. It will take about 4 seconds, probably 3 seconds to succeed. Let's go to our SharePoint list, and you see we have another record on the 9th. Let's just for fun do this again. Let's say this was a file from the 7th, so 2 days ago, and perform this test again just to have some data in our list. But you see how fast this is to create one record here, and how simple this is to implement. Okay, let's do the same for here. So we have this, we go back to our API, we say we want to have the albums, we grab this URL, we have a cat and the URL into there, we have a parse JSON, we grab the body from our request, we go to our website, grab the schema, and of course again we can run this and grab the schema from our input, but this is a good approach probably. So now we want to have a select, and because we have the parse JSON as an input, we can basically say, okay, the ID should be this, and drag it a little bit around. We have the title, and we want to have the user ID, and later on we will be able to concatenate this into one large object if we like. So we have to select, we want to parse this to a CSV table from our select statement. Now let's think of it the other way around. So we get items. Mostly I do first the create item, check it once, and then add this part. But it doesn't really matter how we do this for the functionality. So let's say these are the albums. Now we like to update our file, or update our item, sorry. We're gonna have external data. We're gonna put in our ID. That will make it an apply and a loop. From our selected item, we take the title and we put this to inactive. Then below our loop, we want to create an item. Let's go to create on our list again. External data, show advanced options. This is albums. Of course, the same as we used at the get items. The date int is what we provided in the top. Our CSV is, let's see, and the nicest thing is to just click this away till you have your variable, and it should be active if we create them. And of course, normally I would change those names to be more descriptive, and maybe put in some comments here to make people understand better what I'm doing here. And also for my own peace of mind, being able to know what I'm doing here when I come back here, or I have to do some error checking. Okay, now both scopes are finished. If we now go to our site, we have a user, and if we wait, yeah, we have the user and the album affected here. So now we have two connections and in the same table, just a CSV separated file. Now, okay. Now we have to do something here with in Power Apps with this. Now, as you saw videos before of me, you can of course do that on the App Start, but I don't like to do it because it basically trashes the speed of your application. Now I have a loading screen, and in that loading screen I have an event tab where I can put all my logic. So I create a new toggle. I take this out, put the default on 4, and this default should be triggered by my timer on start parameter. And here you see I already put this in, that this E4 variable will be set from false to true or from true to false, and so forth, triggering this toggle. So this is E4.1, and now we have to build our formula. We're going to do that on change, and what we want to do, we want to have a clear collect, because we want to have a collection with our let's just call it users for now, and the users will be a collection with multiple records in there. Then of course we want to have our albums, and just do an empty to get a structure. And you're right when you say after the albums maybe we want to have the photos, and we could go on like this for a long time. So now let's look what we want. First we want to look up our external data, and you see I already made a connection to my SharePoint list. Is inactive should be equal to 0, and we want to return our data. Of course this is not the only variable, so I put in the end function and formula, and of course you can also do it like this, but I like to have my formulas nicely read it, and I like this more because it reads easier. And of course this is on the wrong place, because this should be here, and the sorry for all the people coming at my door all of the sudden. Doesn't really matter. Let's go on. So the title here is users, and you know the title, I named them users in my SharePoint list, so this will be retrieved very fast. First gonna look at this one. It's just 5 records every day when I have 5 connections, and then from those 5 connections it's gonna take the users, and now we have basically one big string of text we have. Only this text is like CSV separated, so comma separated, so we can easily do a split and then say we want to have those lines we have in our data, we want to have this in a list. And if we would run this, and this is very fast to run, the users, we would have a list with all the lines we have in our CSV file. Now I see that the first starts with ID. I don't want to have that. So let's have a filter and say starts with the result we get back from this lookup and split formula, and this shouldn't start with ID. And now we have a starts with, so it should be not. And you see we can also do this, of course, but I like to have the formulas a little bit more, and that's why I use it like this, because it's basically somehow easier to read for me. I don't know why, but this is the case. So now we have the users without the first line. And of course I could separate the line maybe in flow, but I like people when they go to SharePoint to see what kind of data we have. So that's why I like to leave it in. So now we have a list of text, and in that text there are commas to separate the fields we have in this list. So we want to do something about this. Now, first, let's say we want to loop through all those items. And let's give these items an alias like the data we have, and just return the data from this formula. So this will return a list of records, and the list of records are just returned. So let's try it again. Go back, go here, and our users, still we have the same result. No problem. What we want to do then is to separate those lines. So what we can use is the width formula here, and the width will take a array, and we can return our data again if we like. So let's make this a little bit nicer to read. So here we can say we want to do something with our data. So let's say we have our fields. Doesn't really matter how you call this, because this is in the scope of the for all function. So outside it won't be a problem that you use this over and over again. But here we want to split our data.result, and we want to split it by a comma, because this is a comma separated list. So what we now have is, this is an array, so a list of items, and basically because we have 3 items, we have 3 items now. And what we could do here is return our fields probably, only we have to put it in a property. So let's say fields is the same as fields. Now let's run this to see what's happening. So you see we destructuring this step by step. So we have users and we have a table fields. Okay, and probably in this table we have 3 properties because we split these properties. Now we want to be able to get information outside of this fields. So let's say we have the ID, we had a title, and let's put something empty in this. And we would have these were the users, I think. Let's see what we had here. In the users we had ID, name, and email. So let's use those. So name, let's give it an empty string for now, and email, and also an empty string. Now we had those fields, and we know we split those results into an array, and an array has items. So the first from our fields dot result should be our ID, right? Then let's take this one, and now we want to have the first and 2. So we want to have the first 2, only we want to return only the last item. So when we have 2 items, so the first 2 items of our list, and we return the last, we get basically the second item. That makes sense, doesn't it? So let's take this one and do the same for this 3 fields. So what we now did, we split our data on line feeds. We loop through those line feeds, and we filter those. So we have the headers gone. Then we loop through those items. We take each item and we separate our result based on a comma separated field. and then we create one record with 3 properties and we put values in it there. So this is JSON again, key value pairs, which we create on the fly. Now, let's run this. Go here, and here we see we have a user with an ID, with a name, with an email. And let's go to another screen. What we can do with this is, for example, take a table here, connect this table to my users, and put my fields in there. And you see we now have a gallery with 10 fields. Cool, isn't it? So let's do the same for our albums. And basically we are able to copy this all, put this here, say it should be albums. Still probably we have an ID, but let's check. So here we have our albums, also the ID, so this will make sense. We're gonna split those, only our structure should be different a little bit because we have an ID, a title, and a user ID. Let's go back to Power Apps. So this is a title, user ID. And if we would like so, we can say a user should be a lookup to our users, and our ID is equal to the same as here, this result. And when it's right, when we go here, albums, we have our user record, which is created here inside of our album collection. Let's see if this works. So let's check this out. And as you saw earlier, we can see a preview of a table inside of a formula. But when we go to the collection and we check our items, then we see we don't have the users. So let's see what happens. The ID, user ID. Probably we did something wrong here. Let's check it out if we did something wrong. Let's make this a value. Let's see if this works. Okay, I don't know why this isn't working, because this should work. I don't know why. Let's try first this. So not a lookup, but just the first user to show you that you can do this, and then figure out yourself how to really do this kind of things, because this is basically possible to have this user inside of your collection. And then of course we have to do the photos, but I think this is enough for now to show you how you can implement these kind of things. And of course, because it's a collection, we can easily, let's see if we can show that at the latest thing. Just say this should be collected to our albums, replace the columns, and we have the ID, the title, and our user ID. And now you see we have an item here and we have an item here. Let's see what I did wrong. Strange that it's gonna put it really at the back end. Normally it does do it on the front, but you see here we have all the albums, and here we have all the names, and we can do the same for the photos. So I think this concludes this video about using flow, using just one list with one item for each call you do on the data source to be able to make just one a list which provides for all the information you want to retrieve from a third-party application, and then get it into Power Apps, just rip it apart, put it in a collection, and then use it everywhere. And this, of course, will work very fast in matters of tens of seconds, where having a list with 6,000 items isn't really a good way to work with Power Apps when you don't optimize it. And I think in this case this is not needed even, because this is basically for the day not changing information. So now I hope you like it. If you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the comments. And thanks for watching. Bye.